The third common way of combining two propositions into a single statement is with the phrase if-then. If-then statements are also called conditional statements. Now, the order in an if-then statement matters. In this example, if the animal is a bird, then the animal has a beak. The if part of the statement is kind of like the condition upon which the conclusion is then formed. So the conclusion is what comes in the then part. So most of the time an if-then is written with the if first and then the then second, but it doesn't have to be. The if part, whatever comes after the if, is kind of thought of as the condition for the conclusion happening. The if part, even though it is a condition, is usually called the hypothesis. So condition or hypothesis. So in this example, that would be the animal is a bird. The if is actually not included in the hypothesis. It's just what comes after the if. And then the then proposition is what we call the conclusion. So in this case, the conclusion is the animal has a beak. Once again, the then is not included in the conclusion, then signals that the conclusion is what's happening next. All right, so let's look at another example and identify the hypothesis and conclusion. You'll be paid overtime if you work more than 10 hours today. The hypothesis is the if part of the statement. So what comes after if? If you work more than 10 hours today. So the hypothesis is you work more than 10 hours today. And then the conclusion would be what came first here. You'll be paid overtime. Notice there wasn't a then. Often when we put the conclusion first, we leave off the then. It's implied. But it is kind of implied, so the conclusion is you'll be paid overtime. Again, the hypothesis is the if part of an if-then statement, and the conclusion is the then part. And sometimes then is implied instead of being written out directly. All right, so when is an if-then statement true or false? An if-then statement is false in only one situation, when the hypothesis is true and the conclusion is false. An if-then statement is true for all other situations, including when both the hypothesis and the conclusion are false. And that can be kind of confusing. You might say to yourself, well, wait a second. Both the hypothesis and conclusion, everything in the statement is false, but you're saying that the entire statement is true? Oh, that is the case. That's how if-then statements work in logic. Now, let's try to explain why this is. I'm going to use the example. Let's say your boss tells you if you perform well tomorrow, then you will get a cash bonus. Now, I want you to recall that the hypothesis is the condition upon which the conclusion rests. And let's look at this statement in two ways. Let's first say the hypothesis is true. In other words, you do perform well tomorrow. Okay, say the hypothesis is true, you perform well tomorrow. Then if the conclusion is true and you get a cash bonus, yay! You got a cash bonus, you performed well, you got a cash bonus, that's exactly what your boss said. But if the conclusion is false, you don't get a cash bonus, you are very unhappy. You would say this is unfair, you'd be upset at your boss, you'd be going to the union if you have a union, and you'd be saying, my boss told me that if I performed well tomorrow, that I would get a cash bonus, because the condition was met, but the conclusion did not follow the suit. So when the condition is met, when you have a true hypothesis and the conclusion doesn't follow as also being true, that's when the entire statement is false. This is when you'd have a false statement in an if-then, if the hypothesis is true and the conclusion is false. Now let's look at the other thing that can happen in this scenario is if the original hypothesis, the if part, is false. So even though the original statement said you perform well tomorrow, let's say that's not correct. Say you do not perform well tomorrow. Well, the conclusion could be either that you get a cash bonus or you're not. either way, you'd be okay with getting a cash bonus, right? You'd be just fine. Even if you don't perform well, but you get a cash bonus, you're like, hey, nice job, I got a cash bonus, even though I didn't perform well. And if you don't get a cash bonus, you wouldn't be necessarily happy, but you wouldn't be upset either, because the hypothesis didn't hold true. You didn't perform well tomorrow. And the whole point of this is that your boss told you that if you perform well, then you get the cash bonus. So when the condition is not met, when the hypothesis is false, anything can happen. All bets are off. Are off when the hypothesis is false, or when the condition isn't met. So basically, anytime the hypothesis is false, if the if part is false, you immediately can say that the entire statement is true. And that can feel really weird, but that is logically how we define truth value with if-then statements. So just to repeat, if the if part is true and the then part is true, then you have a true statement. If the if part is true and the then part is false, that's when you have a false statement and if then. If the hypothesis is true, and then the conclusion must follow suit. So if the hypothesis is true, the conclusion must also be true, or the statement is false. Now, if you have a false statement to begin with, you will always get a true statement. So if you start false, then anything can happen, and we just say that the whole statement is true. So let's look at some examples. I'm going to do a little bit more than I did with and or statements, just because if-thens are a little trickier. If rabbits are fish, we know that is false. Then rattlesnakes have 4 legs. That's also false. But remember, if rabbits are fish, if this first statement is false, then anything can happen. All bets are off. So if rabbits are fish, then sure, rattlesnakes can have 4 legs. There's no problem with that, right? So the idea is that anytime the hypothesis or the condition is false, we actually say the entire statement is true. It can feel odd, but that's how if-thens work. If Math 105 is a PCC class, that's true. Then Oregon Community College is located in Oregon. That's also true. Well, 2 true statements also make an entirely true statement. That's one consistency between if, thens, ors, and statements. If both statements are true, the entire both propositions within the statement are true, then the entire statement is true. Example 3. If cows can fly, that's false. Then eagles can fly. That's true. But remember, if the initial condition is false, then anything can happen. All bets are off. If cows can fly, then anything can happen. So we actually say this is true. Again, if the if part is false, we immediately have a true statement. It feels weird, but that's how it works. Now, our last example, if horses are mammals, that's true. Then horses have 2 legs. That's false. Here's a situation where the entire statement is false. This is the one thing where things go wrong. If your condition is true, if your condition is met, then your conclusion must also be met. It also must be true. If the conclusion is false after starting with the conclusion is false after starting with a true hypothesis, you will get a false result for the entire statement.